This is problem 18 from chapter 12. So what we're seeing here are the results of different ratings. The raters were to grade the quality of the applicant based on their resume. So the participants, the subjects in the study, either got text-based resumes that they were going to base their judgments on, or they got resumes that had a certain type of graphic, type 1, or resumes that had another type of graphic, type 2. So before starting this problem, there's just some information that we can gather just by looking at the data here. So we can figure out big N, the total number of scores. So that's just all the scores combined, right? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in each group and 3 groups. So big N is 15. Another thing we can figure out is we can start figuring out the degrees of freedom and then look up the critical F value. So the degrees of freedom for the between is little k minus 1. Little k is the number of groups, so that's 1, 2, 3 groups. So we have 3 minus 1 and 2. Then we have the degrees of freedom within is the summation of the degrees of freedom of each group. So that's n minus 1, so that's 5 in each group. So that is n minus 1 is 4. So it's 4 plus 4 plus 4. So that's 12. So we have 2 and 12, right? So based off of this information, we can figure out what F critical value we're going to need to beat in order to reject the null hypothesis. So remember, we need the degrees of freedom 2 and 12, right? So if we look at our guide here, our table, degrees of freedom between is on the top, it's the columns, so we're at 2. And then degrees of freedom of the denominator of the within is on the bottom, so we got to scroll down to 12 here. So we're at 2 and 12. So I see here that it's 3.88 is the cutoff. 3.88. So the next thing that we could do is, if you recall, we always want to figure out the sum of squares total, and then we partition that into the sum of squares between and within. So another thing we can do right off the bat is just square these scores, right? Because we're going to use the computational formula of sum of squares in order to figure out a lot of the information. So we could call this the text squared column, 64, 100, 64, and 100. And we can call this the graphic 2 squared column. That's 16, 16, 36, 64, and 64. And then we can call this the graphic 2. Oh, this was a graphic 1. That's graphic 1. And this is a graphic 2 column squared. 36, 36, 36, 49, 25. So the next thing that we could do is we could just sum these columns up, and we'll use that information to start putting together the calculations that we're going to figure out. So let me make a little division here. So this is 45, and then I got 409 for this one. This one is 30 and 196. And this one is also 30 and 182. So once I figured these out, I can actually get the grand total, right? So that's one of the things for pieces of information I'm going to need. The grand total is the sum of just all the values, right? So it would be summing 45, 30, and 30, right, for the grand total. So it would be 45 plus 30 plus 30, and that equals 105. So this is 105. circle that. Then we can also get the sum of all the squares, right? And we can get that from adding 409, 196, and 182. So I'm just going to put the answer down right here. So that is 787. Okay, so then now the next step is I could figure out the sum of squares total based off of these two, right? So I can do it right here. I'll just do it like right here. The sum of squares total equals 787 minus 105 squared over big N, right? So big N is 15. Okay, so then that was 52. Okay, so then we can partition this into the sum of sum of squares between and sum of squares within. So the next step is to find the sum of squares between, right? So I mean within. So to find the sum of squares within, we're looking at finding the sum of squares of each group and then adding those, right? So we got to find the sum of squares text, right? So that's 409 minus 45 squared over 5. Okay, so then that's 4. This ends up being 4. And then we can find the sum of squares of graphic 1. That's 196 minus 30 squared over 5. And for that one I got, what did I get? 16. So I got 16 for this one. And then do the same thing for this one, right? So we have sum of squares graphic 2, 182 minus 30 squared over 5. I got 2. Okay, so with these values, I can find the sum of squares within, right? So that's 4 plus 16 plus 2, and that's 22. Okay, so then with the sum of squares within, I can find the sum of squares between, right? So sum of squares between, that's sum of squares total minus sum of squares within. So total is 52 minus 22. So that is 30. Okay, so now I have the sum of squares within, sum of squares between. Now I can start finding the mean squares. Okay, so I can find the mean squares between by taking the sum of squares between over the degrees of freedom between. And that equals, sum of squares between was 30 over degrees of freedom between. And that was little k minus 1, so that's 2. And that equals 15. Okay. So then mean squares within is sum of squares within over degrees of freedom within. So that is, sum of squares within is 22 over degrees of freedom within was 12. So that ended up being mean squares within 22, 1.83. 1.83. So then now with these two, I can find the f, right? So f is mean squares between over mean squares within. Okay, so then that is 15 divided by 1.83, and that is about 8.2. Okay, so our cutoff was 3.88 and we got 8.2. So our decision is to reject the null hypothesis. So apparently there is some kind of difference, a significant difference between the different resumes that were given. So there was some meaningful difference between how much people, the ratings that they gave based off of the type of resume. So at this point, I'm not going to do it in this video, but in order to figure out where the differences were, you would calculate some post-hog tests. But that's it for this question.